So, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Russ Neuman. I teach technology at NYU, and I'm the author of a new book called Evolutionary Intelligence, which tries to give the readers a new perspective on all this stuff about AI they've been hearing about.
Yeah. This is an amazing time to be talking about this, Russ, and I appreciate you making the time to have this conversation. As you alluded to before we started recording, I'm somebody who pays a lot of attention to this space and speaks about it as well. And I want to start with this idea that I propose to the audiences that I present to, which is it's very strange to have a new technology where some of the brightest minds, and not just, windbags like I am, but people who are really developing this stuff have such diametrically opposed perspectives on this. On one hand, you'll have people say, we need to be careful because this could be the end of humanity. On one hand, we have people saying that it's essentially a very cool web interface, primarily with very little substance behind it. And in one instance, you have people saying this is going to change how we use technology and make humanity for the better. I'm wondering what your sentiments are on this weird moment where even the developers of it are so diametrically opposed and what the opportunity might be here.
Well, Mitch, both you and I spend a fair amount of time looking at what comes next. And so both of us, and I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the hype cycle, where when something comes along, uh, usually people who want to sell you something are going to tell you it's so much better than sliced bread or some variant. And in this case, there's a whole group that have now been called the doomers. And they kind of play off of these scenarios where the intelligence that is increasingly manifest in these algorithmic technologies starts to reinvent itself, code itself, and become really smart really fast. And then they do this wonderful anthropomorphic projection and saying, well, then they're going to start acting like humans and take us over and start a fight. And there's so much wonderful literature from the Terminator, HAL in 2001, even the now centuries old Frankenstein mythic notion of creating objects we can't control. And the problem with the doomers, in my view, is that it's thinking that these algorithmic technologies, which don't have thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, where there were scarce resources and we competed with each other and other animals for scarce resources. So the notion that the AI would want to kill everybody and turn the atoms into something else is an understandable, but I think misguided view of I think, strong potentials of this technology.
But if we lever it back from doomsday, the AI decides that, ooh, the nature of the environment of which our CPUs are on are running anochromatic to the actual ecological system. We should try to improve the ecological system. And by doing that, we destroy all humanity. Like, I get that type of conversation. Where I think the middle ground might be is the conversation I've heard people like Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote Sapiens and Homo Deus, talk about this idea that if we have a massive shift in how we work, as one example, and if you look back in places in time like Germany pre-World War II, and suddenly you had plus 25% unemployment, which is really one of the theories of what gave rise to a power like Hitler, that we could, in theory, be in a place where if this does truly create a high level of unemployment, it's a great feeding ground for extremism. It's a great feeding ground for having systems that are operating, that are creating content that don't fall within the laws that we all do in terms of what you can and can't say. There is a simpler kitty corner space that could lead us to a very serious outcome for society that to me seems very plausible and realistic. Does that seem absurd to you as well?
Uh, I wouldn't use the word absurd because I respect the judgment of our colleagues. We say we need to be careful, we need to be cautious, and that the notion that some openness in the design of these things can allow for a variety of protections and guardrails to come to place. So I think what the doomers say is they're exaggerating for effect. When our colleagues said, let's pause all development on AI for 6 months, I believe they knew that wasn't going to happen, but they wanted to make that case a clearly exaggerated case, just as a way to get people to start paying attention to what these dangers are. And I'm going to take, Mitch, if I may, your question as a two-part question. The first part was, what about unemployment? Could that generate such a massive social upheaval that it would lead to some very negative consequences, including, and the image there is the unemployment in Germany and inflation. And I think it's likely to be a much more gradual development. And I'm with the economists who have studied the impacts of new technology and found that very often, and indeed most of the time, these technologies create new jobs. And if you're going to be a blacksmith and horseshoe horses for a living, you're likely to find new employment somewhere. And I think global warming will lead to another set of transitions when various extractive and mining industries are going to move, but that the trends will be gradual, so that it won't be the kind of sudden impact that would lead, I think, to social unrest. The second part implied by your question is how will these new technologies perhaps uh, encourage polarization, the kinds of political extremism that was associated with the National Socialism and the Nazi movements in the 30s. And I think we have a very interesting issue, and that is that when these large language models scrape the internet, they pick up a lot of human hate speech and reproduce it. And what we're watching now is a bunch of fine tuning of these systems to try to identify, capture, and filter that element of the human uh, the human impulse for competition, and often really with very negative consequences. But that brings me around to that what I hope to be the kind of central takeaway from my book, which is that rather than trying to model intelligence on human intelligence, let's model intelligence on a more idealized notion that would complement and compensate for the pretty well known understanding of human limited and often biased judgment about the future.
So I want to go back to something you said earlier. We're going to dance around because a lot of these have very complex responses and questions that I really hope we're going to bring out a fun conversation, which is the game of everything here. You have someone like Sam Altman, founder, co founder of OpenAI. He talks about things like you should definitely regulate us, that this could be extinction level concern. Your response prior was this could be marketing to pay attention to it. I might say, why? If you have a tool like ChatGPT and DAL-E and others that are grabbing a significant market share, almost to the point of monopolistic, even though you have the other players that are being quite aggressive in the space for sure. But still, I believe that we're talking about AI primarily because of the generative AI success of ChatGPT. Why would you draw that attention to yourself? Why would you want that in a world where you're already gaining market share? People seem very excited about it. Why would you put that warning stamp on something in a world where you are seemingly on track to become the next Google without saying that?
Good question. And I can't speak with insider knowledge or direct uh, knowledge of why Sam Altman says what he does, but his statements were, as you've identified them, really surprising and unexpected in his conversations with senior executives in the American government and in his testimony before Congress, where not only did he say you ought to regulate AI, meaning you ought to regulate us, he said you ought to set up an entirely new commission, regulatory entity of some kind to keep track of these things. And he's a very bright guy, a very astute student of these issues. OpenAI, as implied by the name of their company, was designed to be open and transparent. And in its new developments, it's not fully open or transparent. And it's no longer, as you may know, Mitch, no longer entirely nonprofit. And it's very much in bed with Microsoft. As they discovered in order to keep these systems running at scale,
They're
they're going to
expensive. Yeah.
they're going to need the kinds of input in multi-millions of dollars that Microsoft was able to
Billions.
provide.
I thought it was 10 billion, wasn't it, that they'd put in?
Yeah, I'm talking about per day,
Yeah.
just to keep these things running.
All right.
Burn rates. So yes, it's a fascinating topic to speculate about why he took such a dramatic turn towards saying you ought to regulate us. One speculation is he knew well that the American tradition is not to regulate. There may be some interesting differences in Canada and in Europe. The American government has been studying this issue, and executive orders will be released very shortly and address these questions. They tend to focus on competition with China and various kinds of military and security issues. The European AI Regulatory Act, which is going through final stages and likely to be implemented shortly, focuses on facial recognition and privacy, which is a tradition, very strong tradition in Europe, not echoed in the American tradition. So one notion is that he knew damn well it wasn't going to happen. So why not take credit for being open to some form of regulation? And the difficulty, of course, is that how do you regulate something you can't even define? Because any small system that makes decisions algorithmically could be called AI. So you'd need to get a federal license just to sell a pair of shoes that blink when they're stepped on, because the computers in those little shoes have a algorithmic decision system as to whether to blink or not. So a challenge indeed. My notion is there's plenty of laws on the books that identify illegal activity, including issues of hate speech, where we've dealt with the delicate challenge between free speech and the notion of trying to avoid violence, and that we should rely on the laws that blame the perpetrator and the act and not the tool that was used in the process of something that may or may not be illegal.
But what if the perpetrator and the act are generated within this algorithm that wasn't actually even developed by a human, but was prompted? I mean, this is what we're talking about.
Mitch, you ask very difficult questions.
But this is the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Russ, let me like, I don't want you to feel that I'm trying to steel man every argument, because I'm not. What I'm trying to do is illuminate in conversation, which I do
Absolutely.
publicly, and I do this, by the way, in audiences that I speak to, that I think the mistake we're making right now is that we are all too often trying to compare this to an industrial revolution or the printing press. And I do not believe we have ever seen, nor will see a technology like this. Now, again, you might think that, well, that's just marketing hype and hyperbole, and maybe you're right. But my feeling is that if there is anything close to something that is quote unquote intelligent, the real thing we're going to try to define, which I think will be inept at, is actually defining what intelligence or knowledge is. And that's my bigger concern with this technology. So when I ask these things, I'm asking them from that perspective of, again, yes, we have these laws in place, but it's very hard to point to who a creator or the perpetrator was if it is generating it without human intervention and is doing so based off of its own learning of our large language models or whatever data we put into it.
When I said, Mitch, you ask difficult questions, I meant you ask good questions
Oh, okay.
and the kind of difficult that you want to confront. So I have a little story I often tell about why you want to blame the perpetrator in the act. And I say, if a bank robber jumps into a cab, goes to the bank, pulls out a gun, robs the bank, jumps back into the cab and runs away, you don't blame the cab or the gun. You blame the bank robber and the act of robbing the bank. But here's what you've done to make my story more interesting and difficult when you address AI. What if a robocar drives to the bank? A robot jumps out, robs the bank, and gets back into the car. Who do you arrest? Do you try to send the robocar and the robot to jail? And so the issue of assigning responsibility in an age where these uh, technologies, and indeed, when you elaborated on your question, you say the programmer that programmed the robot and the car may not have had any intent whatsoever to deal with bank robbing. That was something else. So the issue is absolutely we've got another whole wave of problems to address, which is identifying responsibility when the decision processes start acting independent.
So, how do we start? How do we start thinking about concern? Let's just start with concern. We see concern coming from the creators. We see concern coming from really intelligent people like Yuval Noah Harari, Douglas Rushkoff, Mark Weinstein. I mean, there's so many people who are much smarter than I am saying things that when I even listen to, I've seen historically, they've been very, very accurate in foreshadowing where things are going. There is this concern in evolutionary intelligence. I think the core of the book is to dissuade some of this concern. And there's a lot of optimism and hope, which I tend to lean towards. Help everybody understand this idea of concern. Should we be concerned? Shouldn't we be concerned? How Pollyanna is it if we're not being concerned? How insane is it to be overly concerned?
Mitch, you said, you may disagree with me, but I think this one is different. And the answer is no, I agree with you. This one is different. When machines, instead of making us stronger and allowing us to travel over longer distances and to communicate over longer distances, when machines start thinking and machines start making decisions, this one is different. And it raises a whole new set of questions about responsibility. And although I'm not going to argue that among my absolute favorite people are a bunch of lawyers, this is an issue that the legal tradition has been confronting in terms of assigning responsibility. And it seems to me that various forms of watermarking and the use of AI to work on the right side of identifying the source of these decision processes. So when somebody says a little AI robot's going to start propagandizing me and making me believe things that aren't true, I'm going to invent a little robot that says, no, that's propaganda and it's not true, and try to use AI to arm those with good intent. So the best defense against a bad AI is uh, a bad guy with AI is a good guy with AI.
Yeah, but understanding full well that when we even think about social media hate speech and content moderation, we're not even an inch close to that. So I think the concern again becomes more plausible when we think what happens when this gets deployed or this is already deployed. But come
I'm making a face because you said we're not even close to algorithmic content
I
moderation. I think we
I
are.
well, I mean, if you take one sniff around what we're seeing online, it takes quite a bit to get something taken down that is clearly illegal and against that. You don't have systems in place that are doing it effectively. I've even seen instances, one example that we talk about fake news was they had an image of what looked like people traveling through a desert. And the text on it was, "Is this what we want?" Now, you could take that to mean 5,000 different ways, and no algorithm is going to catch that as an anti whatever it might be sentiment, which it typically was an anti sentiment to whether it was immigration or otherwise. So, yeah, my faith in the current social media ability to content moderate without this scale is not strong. There's still cyberbullying, there's still a million issues going on. So, again, I want to get back to this idea of why are we concerned, and what would you say to help us be less concerned at this moment in time?
Okay. If I saw on a feed a picture of some kind of migration through a desert, and the question is this what we want? I would react as you did, saying, as these are interactive media, so I can speak as well. And rather than insisting that it be taken down because it might be interpreted as hateful speech, I try to react to it and say, well, maybe that's an image of the Jews wandering through the desert looking for
Yeah, and it's a Passover.
salvation from the Egyptians.
Yeah, and it's like a
So
Passover message.
it's not
Exactly. Yeah.
necessarily it's not necessarily a bad thing. And so my standard impulse is to say, let's respond to hateful speech with more speech rather than censorship. So in the example you gave, I think we are going. Yeah, we need to make steps to try to find ways to identify these things. And when there's an interesting, controversial issue, let's talk about it rather than censor it.
We've been so bad at that. I was just thinking recently about a hospital being bombed and who did that. And whether the result comes out or not, people will double down. People will not believe it. They'll see it as misinformation, disinformation. So the challenge with that is, of course, we have multiple things. This they'll call it a polycrisis, but we have multiple things happening at the same time where you've now lowered faith and belief. You've increased the output of algorithms or now potentially AI. This is where I start moving from the optimist to someone who's cynically optimistic about the space.
All right, let me jump in on your example of the hospital. This would be uh, the rocket that landed next to a hospital in Gaza in the parking lot, and the immediate reaction of Hamas was to blame Israelis, and the Israelis said, no, the evidence points to a failed rocket that had been sent towards Israel by Hamas terrorists. And so, what that illustrates is, if you watch the next 2 days, pro-Palestinians saying, of course it was Israel, and Israelis and supporters of Israel saying, no, we think it's the other way around. And that's a classic case of the confirmation bias. We tend to want to find evidence for what we already believe or want to believe. And the central theme of my book is maybe our intelligence can evolve a little bit. And by recognizing our impulse for the confirmation bias, uh, it's very likely to lead us to incomplete or errorful conclusions. And wanting to know what the right or best thing to do to reach our long term goals might be, we would learn that maybe taking some advice by a non human based resource for predicting the future would be a good idea.
Yeah. In a hopeful world, that would be. So there are two, let's go one component at a time of what's creating this world of evolutionary intelligence. Right now, a lot of the talk is around AGI, artificial general intelligence, this moment in time where the systems can be as smart, if not smarter, and can work in this autonomous way with the ability to even explain back how they did it, even though we might not like the answer to this. For those who might not understand it, can you talk a bit about that moment in time? Some people say we're already there. Many people say we're not even close. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on why it's contentious and why we don't necessarily have agreement on what that moment might look like.
Yeah. AGI is this model of machines acting at a human level. It's the new vocabulary that's replaced the older version, which was called the Turing test, acknowledging the brilliant early work of Alan Turing on the notion that if you're talking to typing away and talking to another individual via the keyboard, if you can't identify that it's uh, a machine and not a human, then we've reached this AGI, human level intelligence. And I think it's about the worst way to go about the next level of designing computers, because it's taking human intelligence as the model of intelligence. And I think that's sort of understandable. We sort of, for the first 400,000 years of our existence as humans on Earth, we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun and all the stars revolved around us. That's sort of a typical way to look at the world, a very human way to look at the world. Evolutionary intelligence is time to move beyond that and start to appreciate the fact that there might be some other ideals for decision making, for living, for organizing ourselves collectively than the traditional human ways we've always done it. We are tribal. If you think about, and you mentioned Harari, who spends a lot of time talking about evolution, um, we aren't particularly strong or fast. Uh, but when we work collectively and we communicate with each other with using sophisticated codes and gestures and language, we can collaboratively capture and uh, outdo even stronger and faster animals for our own survival. And that capacity for collaboration would be a key to our success, in my view. And now we need to collaborate with another resource that we've invented. And hopefully, instead of rebuilding it in as a model of ourselves, we'll build it as a model of our better selves.
You've been doing this a long time, Russ. You're playing with this technology, you're writing about it. What would be your direct commentary? Have we seen AI reach AGI? Do you think this is an interesting design terminal with content that's not as good as Wikipedia on a bad day, as someone like Douglas Rushkoff might say? What do you think when it comes to where we are with AGI?
Okay. You're redirecting me in the notion of modeling the success of artificial intelligence on the human model, which I
Yeah,
accept. Let me
yeah.
do that because a lot of, I mean, I think most people do that. And the last meeting of AI experts estimating what year would be the AGI victory year. Yeah. The number was 2050 something initially, and the most recent, it's moved down to the 2040s. Direct answer to your question, are we there yet? The answer is clearly no. And I think Sam Altman and everybody else would acknowledge that that's the case. And this notion that AI is out there and separate from us as decision makers, it's this box that does things where the agent, the agential power is in the box rather than in the human who is directing the box is, I think, the classic challenge. So my reaction is, will we get to a state when a observer would not be able to tell if the creation of the text and image came from a human or a machine? That's, I think, in the next 10 years, it'll be increasingly difficult to distinguish. But again, I think let's talk about how we can watch a young man or woman approach a decision process, make from their impulses the wrong decision, listen to a corrective from an AI interpreting the environment, and say, oh, maybe I'm not going to do that. I mean, the classic example is, gosh, the lottery is giving out $1 billion. I'm, now I'm going to put my $20 down to enter the lottery because boy, it's a big payoff. And of course, that's a classic case of it looks bigger from where you're standing, but all the logic of it is makes no difference how big the payoff is. The odds of you winning are still, I don't know, 400 times as likely as being hit by lightning, something like
Wow.
that.
So the other issue that I was going to tease out, but we went to AGI first, is this alignment problem. The ability to create something that would follow, as you're instructing us, our desires, that we are the ones who are going to dictate to it what it is. The counter conversation around that is that could be an absurdity, that if this thing truly has some level of intelligence, it might decide what might be better for us and even we might know. It might, in and of itself, take on some level of agency, whether we have the button to stop it or not. But it does seem to be a common conversation, this alignment problem, which is essentially, we say alignment, but what we're really saying is control to ensure that it follows our values. Would that be a fair way to talk about alignment?
Alignment is a theme probably 20 years old now, basically to a notion that whether these machines will develop their own values or can be programmed to align with human values. And I have a series of problems with the logic that the alignment literature raises. First, aligned with whose values? And if there could have been agreement on what the values are at the outset, we'd be a lot better off. I think it's a little bit naive to to deal de- deal so simplistically with, oh well, the human values. Let's make sure they're aligned with that. Now, the second thing is, and you're a student of these issues, so you're well aware of it. When you have a algorithmic decision process that has 5 or 10 sensors that say, is it raining out? Am I going to recommend taking an umbrella, et cetera? Any human can evaluate the relative priorities of those 10 input variables. But the parameters of the neural net transformers that we're currently using for large language models and the similar technologies for large image models have somewhere around uh, uh, 90, 150 billion parameters. And no human is capable of having any understanding of that. So the notion is, since the results of this exact same prompt to a model with 180 billion parameters can be different each time, this whole notion of alignment is not something you can quote quickly correct. So my proposal is, let's pay attention for the next 5 years on this issue of tuning these models. So when we get recognizable distortions, errors, so-called hallucinations, we're getting better at identifying them. And right now, without tuning, nobody can predict how these models are going to behave because they've gotten to be so complex.
I mean, this is the thing. If they get so complex and we, as the creators, can't understand them, this is what creates that fear. Even as I say that sentence, it seems illogical that I would rationally say, if I were a betting individual, that we'll then be able to control it. And I think about Eliezer Yudkowsky, who went through this thought experiment. I think it was on the Lex Friedman podcast, and saying things like, imagine you are transported to another world and 30 seconds for you is 5 years for them. It's just operating at that level. What would be your inclination to work at their pace, essentially, as a thought experiment? So when you say that, Russ, it doesn't make me go, oh, okay, well, that's good. It makes me go, oh, it feels like we could propagate the other side a lot more effectively. That why would it wait for human input or human assignment of a hallucination in a world where it's already 20 steps ahead of us if this were a chess game?
Uh, Mitch, you may have watched me smiling broadly as soon as Eliezer's name was mentioned. He is the doomer to beat all
Oh, he
doomers.
is for sure. Yeah.
He makes a living
Yeah.
describing the doom that is inevitable.
By
And
the way, very eloquently and intelligently.
very eloquently,
Yeah. Often you
intelligently.
hear people like that, you think it's real
All right. So
quackery, but this is pretty well done.
it's Eliezer, they will kill us all, Yudkowsky. And most of his sentences end with the phrase, and they will kill us all. So I welcome his contributions. You're absolutely correct. He's very articulate, very well informed, um, a driven man. Here's among the problems with his logic. Here's what I consider to be the most central. And you identified it when you talked about the time difference that he frequently uses, saying uh, uh, this is the exponential growth, explosive growth of intelligence, where the AI systems start reprogramming themselves. And in several other books, which address this issue, they tell a story that they set this box off, and it starts to reprogram itself. And on a Saturday morning, and by Sunday night, it's reprogrammed itself seven times. Okay, what's missing from that model? The answer is the process of getting smarter means you've identified and made sense of more information from our environment. What makes GPT 3, 4, and 5 what they are is the capacity to deal with immensely large databases. And this notion of reprogramming, you can't reprogram the 180 billion parameters without some information, either human input, machine learning with human contributions to it, human reinforcement, or some other measure of success or failure. In the lingo of the AI world, it's reducing the loss function. They basically, AI programmers say, let's generate something that makes fewer mistakes. So that's when you hear an AI guy say loss function, that's usually what they're referring to. And so you don't just reprogram without input, and input takes time. So the notion that by Sunday afternoon it would have reprogrammed itself seven times is an interesting way to scare people, but I don't think based on a realistic assessment of what it is that self-programming will ultimately provide.
So the other conversation piece that you hear in a more subtle way is just don't plug this thing into the internet. And of course, you see GPT-4 come along and it's integrated into Bing. As someone who uses these tools, their limitations versus when they're not plugged into the internet are very, very obvious and overt. But there is this concern that because of what is already on the internet, that we might then be using assets that would not be the best if we do want to have some type of control or not have it even hallucinate at a scale that we can't even imagine. Where do you sit on this idea of keep it in a box, don't plug it into anything? Because
Then
that's closer to reality than it's and it will kill us all, right?
uh, how does it how does it refine its parameters without some form of interaction with the real world? Currently, the easiest way to do that is with primarily text and on the internet. My colleague at NYU, Jan LeCun, has proposed a new model which says the ultimate test is this kind of self-referential, self-reinforcing learning where you feed a video sequence of human interaction in a given environment to a computer, and then you say, what happens next? Now, here you don't need a human saying you got it right or you got it wrong. Then you just continue the video and you see what happens next. So the notion there is that in order for these technologies that can make sense of an environment ultimately, visually, that will then we'll start getting the capacity to say, yeah, what happens next is the human's going to behave badly. Let's find a way to the human's going to misinterpret that environment. Yeah, I've seen that 10 times. So that's my prediction. And here's my prediction. It wouldn't have to be that way.
What way would it be? So, what do you think is the logic in asking it what would happen next? I'm thinking now about things like culture. How what happens next might be perceived as good or bad based off of things like my gender, my sexuality, my religious beliefs, where I live. I might see something and think that is terrible. We would never allow that. And others might see that as being that's love. That's how we express ourselves.
Well, let me revert to a simpler example, which is the individual comes into a bodega and puts their life savings because they're really feeling for sure they're going to win the lottery this time, and the Siri device on their shoulder or in their glasses or even in their contact lenses whispers into their ear, "Why don't you invest that money in education to see if the longer run benefit for your life would be a result of education rather than a long odds bet on the lottery?" So that's my counterexample.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about those words, knowledge and intelligence. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I'm curious if you think that one of the challenges we will face is in watching this technology take hold and it forcing us to look deeper at ourselves. So, one of the more pragmatic examples of that would be even things like ADHD or how kids go through school. I don't think you and I would disagree that the school system in general is problematic in terms of what kids learn, how they learn it. All, I mean, we've seen that problem continually rise through the world. But I'm wondering how you would see that in reference to this idea of we went from word processors to spell checking to Grammarly, Grammarly to GPT. We're asking people to do things in school systems that these systems can do very, very effectively. What does it mean? What does it mean for those systems when we are looking at things and thinking, yeah, I'm not so sure that we need to be teaching this or using this as a scale. So calculators would be an example of that, where it didn't stop people from becoming mathematicians, but how we learn changed dramatically.
One of the classic examples of this is no longer teaching cursive writing. And I, I think the latest is that cursive is coming back along with vinyl records. I'm not sure how to react to all of that.
EHS too, yeah.
Um, hopefully, what we're going to do is make a bunch of mistakes and try to figure out a way that AI can assist young kids with issues of perceiving their environment. Part of the ADHD example is a systematic way in which a young child misinterprets the behavior of others. And if we can find various corrective ways to help kids with that systematic misperception, that would be great. Um, and I just think we have to accept the fact that we're going to make we're going to make some mistakes before we get it right. And hopefully the occasional errors we make will be learning experiences, and that we as a collective won't say, okay, we're going to outlaw AI altogether because it made a mistake once.
Yeah, that's not what I'm thinking more that if we start seeing real results with this in a positive way, in an optimistic way, and then what you're really talking about in evolutionary intelligence, that we might have to redefine our definition of intelligence or knowledge. And in doing so, that might make us shine a brighter light on a lot of things that we held as these truisms that actually may not have been very quote unquote real. They just fit the system pre this new era.
Mitch, I think you've put it very powerfully. I think the results of our playing with and making mistakes with and achieving things with these new technologies will make us redefine intelligence and think about intelligence. I think those would be very positive issues. You'd mentioned Harari, who's been very influential. I think that's a lot of what he's talking about. Pinker as well
Yeah.
has been raising these
Steven
kinds of
Pinker, yeah.
issues. I think rethinking what is intelligence and coming up with a notion of, as I've argued, evolutionary intelligence, saying, let's put these tools together, recognize that they can make us better. The, if I may, the ultimate uh, imagery for this comes from my reading of Teilhard de Chardin as a teenager, the French Jesuit scientist, priest, who came up with the concept of the omega point, which can be, I think, somewhat summarized by the notion that, well, we kept a hard time understanding how God invented mankind. What if mankind actually invents God, and the evolution towards an ultimate sense of morality will be because humans got better and better at understanding the moral issues?
Yeah. I mean, this is the hope. So I like I said, I'm very much an optimist. I've become more and more cynical or scared because people who I really believe are smarter than me are saying things that are throwing me for a bit of a loop. And I think that's good because it's creating a world where I can cognitively at least think about my own thought experiments about really where do we want this to go and how do we want this to be. One of them that feels very evident to me, and I'd love your feedback on this, and not just your feedback on it, but I guess how you would resolve the challenge is one of the things I keep hearing time and time again is we go through a system. We already discussed school and we achieve a high level of degree of professionalism and that leads us to a job that has been a knowledge based job that we work at very, very effectively and efficiently. In theory, a lot of these jobs still tend to be quite repetitive in their work. And this is the first thing that AI likes to eat, anything that is repetitive that you do. So again, you could have studied 30 years and had multi doctorates and gone into this work, but it's still fundamentally repetitive. And that's something AI really, really likes. That tends to be a concern that we hear people talk about, that what's it going to do in terms of knowledge workers and what does that look like? What's left for us to do? We've heard the term the useless class being tossed around, those who know how to nurture and speak to the algorithms, and everyone else who will be useless, even if you're a doctor, an engineer, etc. Can you talk a little bit about if you believe that one is if you believe that to be true, that it's good at doing those repetitive knowledge-based works, and then what do you feel is the outcome? I don't like this idea that all of a sudden all of us become some level of prompt engineers or something. That doesn't sound accurate or it doesn't feel real to me. What do you think?
Um, will AI be especially attuned to repetitive tasks, knowledge tasks? The answer is yes, as you know. That will be one of its demonstrable strengths. Will it put doctors and lawyers and podcast hosts out of business? No. And the example I draw attention to is the original work where we said, oh my gosh, these things are smart, was the original battles in chess between, I guess it was Watson, Deep Blue, and this is now, what, 15, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
that grandmasters would lose matches against these mechanical machine chess playing boxes that were trained to play chess. And the I'm forgetting which Russian grandmaster it was that lost to the IBM Watson machine. But he demonstrated later that the combination of a computer plus a human working together was even better than the computer by itself or a human by itself. And I think that's the lesson. And that radiologists have done research on how good these graphic analytic AI systems are, has pointed out that their percentages are sometimes better than human percentages. But the best percentages is when the two work together and complement each other. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I feel very optimistic about that. My my worry is the balance of when creators are moving too much to be editors, that the creator part is what gives it the life. That ultimately, if we realize that that role is increasingly going away because of how the tool works, that I don't know what the future is in a world where it's mostly editors. I feel like that would be a boring world.
You're fearful of the current fashion of prompt engineering, and you say, "I didn't go through life to become a prompt engineer."
Or to
And I
audit
want
it.
you,
Worse is auditing it, right? Because soon you won't need the prompt engineer, you'll just be auditing it, right?
okay. So, to make you feel better, Mitch, I want to promise you that the era of prompt engineering is going to go away, just as disco went away,
Right.
and the future is bright.
Okay. Well, I'll take your word for that one. I'm going to hold you to it, I guess. When you think about the future of work, what do you see? So you talked about how we work together. What does that physically or strategically look like? So let's use an example like an accountant who might have to go through reams of Excel files and court laws and taxations from government in a world where that is suddenly the system's really good at aggregating multiple disparate databases, coming up with answers. Is it a world that where accountants become auditors? Like, can you talk a bit about how you see the best case scenario looking for that? Or choose another industry, I don't care.
Well, I don't know a lot about the auditing
Well,
field.
clearly neither do I.
It,
I made up a lot of words there, so
okay, so oh, now we can have some real fun with auditing. Okay,
exactly, yeah.
as two experts on auditing, we will compare notes.
It's the internet.
And
We're experts in everything, Russ. Yeah.
so, my notion is that it's very hard for an auditor to find an anomaly because to do so means you've got to review just reams and reams of data, and the eyes glaze over. But AI systems are pretty good at finding anomalies. And so it's already been announced, and the response of American taxpayers has been significant to the notion that the use of AI by the American uh, Internal Revenue Service is going to be even better at finding anomalies and therefore catching those that would be a little bit overly rambunctious in their definitions of deductions. Means that, yeah, indeed, it's gonna be a plus for finding economic anomalies. And the other issue that I'm sure the Wall Street types are very interested in is it's going to find patterns and make predictions about investment. We'll probably go through a height cycle. Um, we've witnessed a similar process where I guess about 10 years ago, the mathematical whizzes thought that they had figured everything out on Wall Street. And until they went bust for a variety of very interesting reasons, there was a fashion. That doesn't mean there won't be ways in which we can use these technologies to make meaningful projections. It's just let's not exaggerate their power.
Yeah. What gives you confidence that we won't screw this up? So the way in which you hear both sides arguing this, there's probably three sides, but all three sides arguing this would be, we're top of the food chain. We're really intelligent people. But boy, oh boy, do we do the stupidest things.
The question is, what gives me confidence that we won't screw this up? And my response is, I am confident that we will screw it up and recognize that we screwed it up. And hopefully the screw up won't be so serious that we won't have enough time to correct it.
Okay. And then I'm also curious about the horse and the rider. You've talked about this example, or I've seen it in some of the work. And again, it's soothing. It's nice to hear that. But my thought was, what happens when the horse doesn't need the rider? Because it's very possible. So is your theory that the horse will always need the driver, I guess? Or do you understand, or I'm sure you understand this, or Or how do you feel about this idea that, we could be at a place where, and again, I ask this because out of the gates, when I have a tool like ChatGPT do some of my work in journalism, it's clear when I look at it that the horse doesn't need the rider in many instances.
When I was a teenager, we visited relatives in California who had a horse next to their house in Los Altos Hills. And I was there for a week. And as a teenager, I'd ride the horse every day and got tremendous confidence in my ability as a rider. And then, many years later, as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, we had a retreat for our faculty, in which case they'd taken a bunch of horses and I jumped on the horse, confidence that everything was, boy, what, if I nailed this one, I don't need any instruction. The horse threw me and I landed in a pile of horse shit. And I learned my lesson. I'm going to return to my notion. Yeah, I think we're going to make some mistakes. I didn't break anything. The horse didn't stomp on me. I got back on the horse. And so, there's going to be a little horse shit in the future of our lives, but we'll overcome it.
Oh, there's so much of it right now, Russ. I can't even tell you. Tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
I've already referred to it, and it was my sense that we've got all these assumptions that somebody made up all the rules, and we're just a long time ago, some guy with a white beard made up all these rules, and we're still trying to figure them out. And the notion from reading this theology as a kid, saying, "What if we can make the rules?" Made me think differently about it, and I'm hopeful that we'll figure that out and we'll screw up a little bit, but ultimately get it right.
I hope you're right. The new book is called Evolutionary Intelligence. You've written a whole bunch of other books. You're currently at NYU in media technology. Russ, let people know where they can find out more information about you or read more of your work, things like that.
I have a website, WRNEUMAN.com. And I try to post the new stuff there. And the new stuff there now is my new book, Evolutionary Intelligence.
That's great. Thanks so much for your time, Russ.
Thank you, Mitch. Appreciate it.